With her mind made up, she turned the corner to follow him. She probably should have indicated first to prevent any angry blast from another motorist who had the actual right of way. She'd been too busy confused to remember the road rules. She reached for that book of apologies for ladies in cars. She noticed Ralf noticing her transgression. He turned to look at her with his usual disapproving frown. He took her ammunition and loaded his stereotype gun with it. "What did I tell you? Bloody women drivers." There was more of that patented contempt in his face. Just because she's a hot-throbbing bonk bucket, she thinks she can drive like a lunatic and get away with it. Ralf had now turned away from her traffic transgression, and so hadn't noticed that she had started to follow him. He was too busy musing to himself to notice anyway. She found his conversation starting to get rather distasteful. Hot-throbbing bonk bucket? She was confused and annoyed both at the same time. What the hell does that mean? She added to her emotional multitasking with a sudden thought that made her smile to herself. I think that means he likes me. It was probably just as well he hadn't noticed her stalking, investigating him, as his lust had become tinged with bitterness. If only I was an arresting officer, I'd certainly give her ass a damn good spanking. Spanking? Contempt for the male preoccupation with kinky sex gave her plenty of ammunition. Sounds like he's a bit of a... Oh, shit! She'd been too busy being flattered and dismayed at the same time to notice she had actually driven past him. She finally realised what had happened and was suddenly forced to pull over to let him catch up. She leaned over to the glove box to try to appear innocent. She wasn't following him. She was just getting something out of her glove box for a perfectly innocent reason. The suspicion was clear on her radio as well. Was she following me or something? This remark probably demonstrated how miserable her failure had been and left her feeling embarrassed. Fortunately for her, he had dismissed his suspicion in favour of a bit of yearning. He visually gave a slight shrug and audibly he was almost pleased at this new development. I can't say I'd mind if she was. Samantha heard this and was intrigued. Maybe her unsubtle attempt at stalking, innocent investigation, might have been about to pay off, big time. She waited to hear more and found that there certainly was more. Ralf didn't show any emotion on his face, but he certainly had some feeling in his voice. She certainly is one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. She definitely heard this and blushed a little. She tried to keep a smile off her face, but failed miserably. I wouldn't want Ralf and Samantha to be tasked with saving the world from nuclear destruction. Their ability to fail miserably at regular intervals would no doubt see us all turned into blackened cinders. If she couldn't contain her blushing smile, she at least managed to direct her smile away from Ralf in case it raised his suspicion levels. She remembered that she was supposed to be searching for something in her glove box. She grabbed a hairbrush and pretended to brush her hair. That seemed perfectly reasonable and innocent, as women were always brushing their hair, even by the side of the road. Playing with her hair was also a subtle signal to a man that she was receptive to his attentions. This was apparently universal, like a man getting a raging hard-on as a universal signal of subtlety. She hoped that Ralf was well tuned to such female subtlety. She waited for more compliments to pour forth from the radio. They did indeed come pouring thick and fast like runny custard. Ralf now had a bit of a wistful look on his face and some definite yearning in his voice. Big brown eyes and beautiful hair. His eyes widened with sudden lust. Gorgeous hair. Despite her memory lapse, she was enjoying the attention of this handsome man, despite his rather unsubtle attempts to describe her assets. She continued combing her so-called gorgeous hair and continued listening out for more compliments, subtle or not. Ralf certainly didn't disappoint in the quantity of description or the lack of subtlety. He eyed her up and down as best he could, with her still sitting in her car. Yea, verily, she does have great tits. I told you about his subtlety limitations. She may not have appreciated the bluntness of his assessment, and his lack of subtlety certainly knew no bounds. We're talking Melon City. The mock-serious medieval language hardly took the edge off the fruity reference, and it definitely brought a blush to her cheeks. Her hair-brushing became less practical and more seductive in nature. A qualified hairdresser, or hair technician as they are probably called today, may have been critical of her technique, but then again, it was her own hair, she could do what she liked with it, as seductively as she liked. If Ralf had been trying to chat her up face to face, her actions would have been rather unsubtle themselves. In this strange mind-to-face chat-up technique, she was trying to send him subtle signals that he was on the right track. despite the fact that he technically didn't even know he was on a train at all, so to speak. The look of lust was beginning to turn gradually into a frown of dismay. She couldn't understand why and gave a few more of her shampoo commercial hair flicks, in case that helped. May have been the fact that she had gotten so carried away she was now rubbing the hairbrush against her cheek instead of her hair. May have been done in an equally seductive way, but it just looked weird. If it had been his hand, that might have looked natural and seductive. Maybe she was imagining that he was rubbing his hand against her cheek. Whatever was going on in her mind, the result looked bizarre to Ralf, and he wasn't afraid to say so. He did it with a mixture of 2/3 confusion and 1/3 disgust. She seems to be in love with that box of tampons, though. She was too busy rubbing her cheek seductively to comprehend this remark straight away. But eventually the full meaning sunk in. She looked at her hairbrush and suddenly realised that not only had she been rubbing it against her cheek, but it wasn't even a hairbrush, it was indeed a box of tampons. She realised that he had been watching her pretend to comb her hair with a box of tampons. What kind of subtle signal was that? Having made this realisation, she further realised that he had been watching all of this, and it was the cause of his growing frown of dismay. She suddenly gaped in horror and dropped the box on the floor as if it was a slimy, squirmy, live frog. Let that be a lesson to you all. Always look what you are doing when you reach into your glove box. With the box safely out of her hand, she was forced to face Ralf both literally and figuratively. She looked up and met his dismayed gaze. Their eyes locked for the first time since this whole confusing incident began. She blushed again with embarrassment and gave him a rather sheepish look. Thankfully, she hadn't been rubbing a sheep against her face. He observed her embarrassed, sheepish smile and simply shook his head. He then turned and began to walk away once more. If he hadn't picked up on the subtle seduction technique she had been using, then he probably would have thought she'd just stopped her car in order to rub her face with a cardboard box. He'd heard of OCD, but this was WCD, weird compulsive disorder. The contents of the box probably didn't really matter. She could have been using a box of cigarettes, aspirin, or even paper clips. He wasn't so stupid and naive as to think this was the correct procedure for deploying a tampon, so that explanation had not been considered. As for what he had been considering, there was very little coming out of the mind drive, except a rather exasperated, dismissive grunt. Crazy bitch.